Hi, my name's Lucy Johnston. I'm a clinical psychologist. I've worked in the NHS for many years in mental health teams, and I'm currently describing myself as an independent writer and trainer.
You hold a very unorthodox view that actually psychiatric disorders and diagnosis are not the best way to go about engaging with mental health.
Well, it used to be a very unorthodox view. It's becoming less unorthodox. And one of the things that I think a lot of people don't realise is that this is changed a bit from being seen as a rather extreme, strange position. And actually, even the very senior clinicians who put together the list of psychiatric disorders and illnesses, which appear in great big books called things like DSM and ICD, are openly saying that this isn't really working, that these are not proper scientific categories, that we need to, essentially tear that up and start again. So it's much less unorthodox than it used to be. There's a growing number of people, myself and other professionals, but also people who've been through services themselves, saying this wasn't a helpful way of understanding my distress. My distress is very real. Nobody's denying that, but actually there are better ways of understanding it, and there are significant disadvantages to giving people a diagnostic label and then kind of embarking on the whole journey of I've got a mental illness with everything that implies. What is the alternative to psychiatric diagnosis? Well, it's kind of simple, listening to people's stories. Everybody comes into mental health services with a story, very often a very distressing and quite often very complicated story, quite often dating back many years. Diagnosis obscures people's stories. What we need to do is listen to people's stories. That'll give us all the information we need to help people find a way forward. So this is a quote from an excellent book which is on sale today, Searching for a Rose Garden. It's entirely written by service users survivors, so which makes it, unusual and particularly powerful, I would say. And this is what one of them said: until we're able to use our own words to tell our own stories, the context we find ourselves in this case the psychiatric system, says our stories for us and usually gets it wrong. In the context of the medical model, the story we learn to say is that we are ill. We begin to see ourselves as ill. We tell stories of illness, and the psychiatric system, and by extension society, accepts illness as the story of our distress. Being able to tell your own story, not the illness story, sets a new social context, one in which mad people are seen in a new light. In part, healing happens through the restoring of our lives. I don't know about you, but I find that a very powerful quote. Telling a different story, the narrative of medicine, which is often imposed on us, and which we very rarely have a choice about, as opposed to the opportunity to put together your own story, restore your own life. When he, a mental health professional, proclaimed, "You have a mental illness," I responded, "I thought I had stories to tell." I sometimes think this is a question we make too simple. The alternative to diagnosing people is to not diagnose them. And it's like those many, many tedious arguments I've had about ECT over many, many years. Well, what do we do instead of give people ECT? Well, don't give them ECT. It's kind of obvious because we already have alternatives. We have ordinary language descriptions. We talk about feeling miserable or desperate or suicidal or all over the place or confused or terrified. These, we have been fooled into thinking or believing that these are not accurate descriptions of the mental illnesses we may be suffering from, but actually these are just as accurate and valid. If we want to move beyond particular descriptions, like I hear voices, or I have, my moods are very all over the place, or I feel very anxious and scared, then what we need to find is various ways of telling our story. Either being in a diagnostically based world, few people can afford to give up their diagnosis entirely. It's needed at the very least, for some practical purposes, but you may decide you do not wish to define yourselves and your problems in this way. I think that's a really, really important right. It's a right that's seldom offered, and indeed it's an option that most people are unaware of, because the diagnostic language, the diagnostic way of thinking has embedded itself so deeply in our culture, in our collective minds. Anyone on the street who might openly say, I don't know anything about mental health, will talk about mental illness as though it's a thing. Show me any media article, even in our more enlightened papers, that doesn't unthinkingly use the language of medicine, symptom, patient, illness, depression, all these anxiety disorders, all that stuff. you know, these are complex questions. We seem as a society actually to be very bad at discussing this. If anyone starts to question diagnosis, then immediately you're likely to get a reaction as though you're blaming someone. It seems as though, in a rather useful phrase, we have a kind of brain or blame understanding of distress. You know, if it's not something that went wrong in my brain, of course we have absolutely no evidence at all that it is, then you must be saying I'm inventing it, or I'm to blame, or I should pull myself together, or it's someone's fault, or I should go and be really cross with my mother for dropping my head when I was 3, or whatever. So actually I think we need more sophisticated ways of understanding that fall between those two polarities. Because to be honest, if I felt the alternative was brain or blame, I would go for the brain one, who wouldn't? But we actually need alternatives that are kind of in between those two polarities. So I hope to suggest what some of those might be. Okay, did James show you some of these quotes? He may or may not have done. He certainly has shown you some similar ones. So this is kind of putting the context. I don't want to just repeat what James has said, but I will flash a few slides past you. So a lot of these debates came to a head, though they've been around for decades. They've been around since the start of psychiatry as we know it. With the publication of DSM-5 in May 2013, you will know what DSM is, if you've heard James, the kind of so-called Bible of diagnoses. And what's particularly interesting about this is that these controversies, which, as I say, have been around for decades, some of the most outspoken critics were the very people who draw up these manuals. So Dr. Alan Francis, the chair of the DSM-4 committee, and you know you're in trouble as a member of the DSM-5 committee when your chief critic is a member of the DSM-4 committee. DSM-5 will radically and recklessly expand the boundaries of psychiatry. There's no reason to believe that DSM-5 is safe or scientifically sound. Now, I get into an awful lot of trouble on Twitter when I say things like that, but he said it. He should know. He drew up these categories. These are two other very senior, I mean, these are establishment psychiatrists. These are not mavericks or extremists or so-called anti-psychiatrists. NIMH is the world's largest funding body for mental health. Totally wrong, an absolute scientific nightmare. Patients deserve better. In an unusual moment of frankness, which I suspect he may regret, Dr. Alan Francis admitted there's no definition of a mental disorder. I mean, you just can't define it. It's bullshit. So this is kind of extraordinary stuff, and it really concerns me that so little of this filters down to professionals, let alone to service users or survivors. Because how many people do you know who were told at the point of being assured that they had, let's say, personality disorder or bipolar disorder or psychosis or depression or whatever, well, you could call this bipolar disorder or personality disorder, but you could also call it bullshit. The people who invented these labels have called it exactly that. I've yet to hear of an example. People have a right to know that there are serious concerns about the validity, the scientific validity of these labels.